Welcome to the Stainless Souls podcast, brought to you by the Realization of Stainless Souls, a come-as-you-are church of recovery and discovery. This is episode 2, the basics of a higher power. I am your host, Bob Hobbs. One of the biggest issues that we face when we are suffering from an affliction or afflictions, such as those that we focus on here at the Realization of Stainless Souls, those are addiction, codependency, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and homelessness. When we start to look for help, we try to find our way out of the darkness. We find ourselves confronted with the idea or an idea of a higher power or of God. And because our suffering has been so deep and so dark for so long, we have a very difficult time accepting the idea of a higher power or a God. And that issue is amplified or agitated by the fact that when we were younger, we were taught, most of us anyway, were taught something about God, and in order for us to learn, we had to give God form. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we contain God in a form created by the human mind, we have eliminated God, because God cannot be contained. However, if we didn't put a container around God or a form around God, we would have a very difficult time discussing God or concepts about creation, because we would have no frame of reference in which to describe what we mean. But we have to keep in mind that as we become wiser, as we become older, that the container and the form and the description and the definition that we placed upon God with our human mind is actually putting a limit upon what God might actually be, or could be, or is. To make matters even worse, when we are thinking about or discussing God, especially when we have to confront God in healing from any of these afflictions, we're angry. We're angry and frustrated, and we feel that whatever our affliction is, we didn't deserve it. We weren't bad people. We know other people who were much worse than we were, who don't suffer the way that we did. How can God have all this suffering if he's all powerful in the universe? Why are there good people and bad people? Why are babies born sick? Why do all of these things happen? And it becomes very difficult for us to believe in the existence of, let alone have faith in, a higher power that is all loving and merciful. But it all stems from the very beginning concepts that we had about God when we were younger, which were required in order for us to grasp intellectually what God was or is. Believing that God has the form of a human being, a man or a woman, and that he exists somewhere in this physical universe is one of the biggest mistakes that we can make when we are trying to discover ourselves and God along a spiritual path. Because one, we put God inside the infinite universe that he created, which, if you think about it, when you bake a cake, you're not in the cake. You, the creator, are on the outside of the cake. So, for us to believe or to think that God created an entire universe and then he's within it and he's bound by the rules or the laws that are in the universe that he created, that's just a very immature, childish way to think about creation and about the Creator. I bring this up because as you meditate, if you commit to a daily meditation practice, many things will be discovered as truths. And one of them is a better idea of who or what God is. And if not a who or what he is, certainly a much better idea of who or what he is not or she is not. At some point in the future, in a future episode, we will dig into the chapter in the big book called We Agnostics and try to put a little bit of detail around it. We will address some of the ideas of atheists, agnostics, and the various denominations of faith that are out there in the course of this podcast. But the most important thing to anyone listening who is seeking a higher power, who believes that their God let them down, who believes that God is hateful or spiteful, the two best pieces of advice that I can give you are, one, meditate, and two, have an open mind. And don't let anyone tell you, including this podcast, who or what is true, because no human being can tell you what is or is not true. You must. And the purpose of life is to give you the opportunity to do this. You must discover the truth on your own. And in the discovery of the truth, at some point you have to make a choice. Using your own free will, granted you by divine providence, to choose to continue to pursue material desires in the physical world, or to pursue a finding of and emerging back into the Creator. So we'll talk about these concepts very often, both in blog posts and podcasts. I think that being a person who studies theocentric psychology and practices God-centered living, that it's important for all of us to seek and find a God of our understanding. But the seeking and the finding doesn't happen outside of you. It only happens inside of you. And I think that you'll find that that's where God is. And if you can really concentrate, really focus yourself and your attention and your awareness to the very center of your mind, the very nucleus where all of you is spawned from, that in that place, that very tiny, infinitesimal place, you will find the infinite and the eternal God. But it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of time. But once you find it, no one will need to convince you any further of anything about what's real, what's true, because you'll know. I want to spend a few minutes just talking about what Lao Tzu wrote about God, or the Tao. Lao Tzu was the author of the Tao Te Ching, and this is the first verse. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao is both named and nameless. As nameless, it is the origin of all things. As named, it is the mother of 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one sees only the manifestations. And the mystery itself is the doorway to all understanding. Now, back in the 70s, although I was just a kid, if I wasn't just a kid, we'd say that's pretty heavy. That's some heavy-duty philosophy right there. What the hell does Lao Tzu mean by all of that? And if you were paying attention earlier when we were talking about who and what God might be and what we did when we gave him form, we made him a finite person when we gave him form. When we gave him a name, we took his infinity and his eternalness away, and we made him finite. So here in the first verse, where Lao Tzu says, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. That means simply the Tao that you and I can have a conversation about is not the eternal one. Because anything that we can capture in our human mind, which is finite, as far as we know, cannot be infinite or eternal. So if you and I can have a conversation about something, it cannot be infinite or eternal. So when you and I have a conversation about God or a higher power, we're not talking about the absolute God or the absolute higher power. Then he goes on to say, the name that can be named is not the eternal name, and that's the same thing. No word made by 26 or so sounds with the human lips and the human tongue can describe, or even begin to describe, the infinite and eternal nature of God. So, if you can name it, it's not it. Then he goes on to say, the Tao is both named and nameless. As nameless, it is the origin of all things. As named, it is the mother of 10,000 things. There's a lot of philosophy and theology in those 3 lines of the first verse. But just building upon the layers that we've already discussed, here Lao Tzu is saying that when you think about God without naming or containing or giving it form, that's the God that created everything. But once you try to name it, him or her, then it isn't the God that created all things. It's the mother of 10,000 things, or some finite number less than infinity. That version of God, the one that is named the mother, does exist in the physical universe because it's finite. And I don't want to spend a whole podcast right now talking about who's the mother, who's the father, what's the Trinity, and complicated, complex issues like that. The purpose of this podcast is to recognize that our presuppositions of who or what God might be that we grew up with and that now we're angry with or we don't believe in is probably an inaccurate view, an inaccurate perspective of the truth. And so if you just buy that, like if you just buy, I don't know the truth, that's good enough because you open yourself up to the idea of, well, then what is the truth? And you start looking for the truth. And you put yourself on a path where you can discover the truth. Going a little deeper. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one sees only the manifestations. These 2 lines simply mean that if you're attached to finding out the secret of the mystery, if your desire is to figure out the mystery, you aren't going to figure it out. You're only going to see what was created, the physical material universe. Ever desiring, one sees only the manifestations. Ever desireless, without attachment, without desire, being fully indifferent, accepting what is, being a being, allows you to see the mystery. And it's one of those paradoxes that you just have to struggle with in meditation, but it is as true as any other paradox that you're going to find in the Tao Te Ching or in the Big Book or in any other book in philosophy. When you're desireless, you can see the mystery. When you're desiring, you only see manifestations. And here's the kicker. The mystery itself is the doorway to all understanding. So, in order to find the door to all understanding, you have to find the mystery. And in order to find the mystery, you have to be desireless of finding the mystery. For those of you who are still angry, still hurt, still frustrated with the idea of a creator or a higher power or a universal intelligence or a God of your understanding, I can only ask you to be open to whatever comes. Don't try to force yourself into being an agnostic or an atheist. Don't try to force yourself into being a believer of any kind. Just be open to whatever the truth is, and take your openness into meditation again and again and again. And in time, these mysteries will disclose themselves to you. And when they do, you will find a sense of peace, but also a curiosity to discover more. And the very bright side of all of this is that while all of this is transpiring, you find yourself less and less concerned with, frankly, all things in the material world, but most importantly for us who are suffering, our trauma eases. Our addiction eases. Our suicidal ideation eases. Our codependent need to control all things and all people subsides. And the hopeless and helpless nature that we've adopted in becoming homeless or becoming willing to be homeless also subsides. And all these things take time. They take multiple iterations. Nothing happens all at once. But over the course of days, the successes, the virtues of these practices begin to build up. And there's a compounding rate of growth where every day builds on each previous day. And before long, maybe you'll find yourself making a spiritual podcast for a church that you founded. My hope and prayer is that you find the truth, that you look in the right place, that you listen to the right people. All of it's inside of you. God bless you all.